Today, we're reviewing a motivational script targeting English learners that explores how building a strong mindset, practicing self-discipline, and managing time can transform one's life. I mean, we've got a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. So a key theme running through this material seems to be
this pursuit of monumental personal transformation. And that actually brings us directly to our first major editorial observation. The over-reliance on ubiquitous celebrity anecdotes dilutes the script's personal impact and originality.
yeah, absolutely. When reading through this text, you see a really heavy rotation of these highly recognizable, almost mythical figures used to anchor the concepts.
Right, it's very noticeable.
I mean, the script brings in Elon Musk building his companies to change the future, Kobe Bryant training relentlessly while others relax, Warren Buffett reading for hours on end, and Jim Carrey writing himself that famous check.
It feels very familiar.
It does. It feels akin to a greatest hits album of motivational quotes. And, the shorthand is incredibly clear. We all recognize the cultural weight these figures carry.
Of course.
But from an editorial standpoint, we have heard these specific tracks a few too many times across thousands of other self-help videos. The impact of the underlying lesson just ends up blunted by the sheer familiarity of the messenger.
That makes sense, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion? Like the idea that relying on these massive billionaire and celebrity personas actually creates a structural disconnect for this specific audience?
A disconnect? How so?
Well, the weakness here isn't merely that the examples are cliché. It's that they actively alienate the target demographic. I mean, the listener is tuning into a slow English podcast to build practical daily habits and acquire a language,
Right.
So, referencing Elon Musk deciding he wants to alter the trajectory of human history, it feels drastically misaligned with the intimate, daily, and deeply frustrating struggles of an ESL learner. The scale of the examples is just so massive, so entirely out of reach, that the listener might subconsciously decide the advice doesn't apply to their journey at all.
Okay, I can see the argument for scale being a problem, but let me push back on that for a moment.
Sure.
Doesn't an audience click on motivational content specifically for escapism? Are we risking boring the listener by reminding them of their mundane everyday life instead of giving them the high-octane fantasy of an NBA star or a tech billionaire? Usually, people want to be told they can conquer the world.
That is a fair point. And escapism is incredibly effective for entertainment, but it is notoriously terrible for behavioral change.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when people consume stories of monumental, outlier success, they often experience a psychological phenomenon known as vicarious goal satiation.
Vicarious goal satiation. Okay, what is that?
Basically, the listener gets a dopamine hit just by imagining themselves as Kobe Bryant, and that unearned sense of accomplishment actually decreases their drive to do the tedious, unglamorous work in front of them. The gap between reality and the example is simply too wide.
That is fascinating. So the fantasy actually hurts the execution.
Exactly. Motivation requires an attainable gap. You need to present a challenge that is difficult, but visibly within the listener's immediate reach. So the suggestion for improvement here is to ground these overarching concepts in highly relatable, everyday scenarios, or alternatively, lean heavily into the specific angle that the title of the piece promises.
All right, the title explicitly mentions Jack Ma motivation, yet Jack Ma is only mentioned in passing.
Exactly. The writer needs to create a unique through line that feels customized to the audience's actual capacity for action.
Putting that into practice on the page requires a total shift in perspective. Take the section detailing Kobe Bryant training on the basketball court.
Yeah, what could they do instead?
Instead of relying on that ubiquitous narrative, the writer could describe a highly specific, accessible persona. Picture an ESL learner who wakes up 30 minutes early. The house is completely dark. It is silent.
Oh, I love that imagery.
They sit at a cramped kitchen table with a cheap cup of instant coffee and deliberately practice their grammar workbook while their family is still asleep in the next room. That paints a vivid picture that an English learner can literally step into tomorrow morning.
That immediate accessibility changes the entire dynamic of the script. It strips away the intimidation factor. It tells the listener that discipline isn't an innate superpower reserved for Olympians. It is simply a quiet choice made at a kitchen table.
Right, it's manageable.
Now, if the author feels strongly about keeping the celebrity angle because it's vital for click-through rates, they absolutely must fulfill the promise of their own title. Since they promised Jack Ma motivation, they should remove Musk, Bryant, Buffett, and Carey entirely. Use Jack Ma's highly specific early struggles to anchor the core concepts throughout the entire duration of the script.
Because he was famously the only individual rejected out of 24 applicants for a fast food job. And he struggled immensely with traditional schooling, failing his university entrance exams multiple times.
Use those exact stories. When discussing the agonizing pain of failure, detail how Jack Ma felt walking out of that specific fast food interview while his peers celebrated.
Right, it takes the broad concept of failure and shrinks it down to a single humiliating afternoon that any adult can relate to.
It delivers on the title's promise, provides a cohesive narrative anchor, and transforms the script from a generic motivational blend into a focused original narrative.
Okay, so let's assume the writer takes this advice. They strip out the scattered billionaires and ground the narrative in a singular, focused through line. That solves the issue of who we are focusing on.
Exactly.
But even with a relatable protagonist, throwing 6 massive psychological concepts at a listener back-to-back creates an entirely different kind of exhaustion. Which brings us to pacing.
Yes. The pacing acts more like a rapid-fire checklist of disconnected self-help concepts rather than a cohesive thematic journey.
The transitions in this script are relentless. I mean, we move swiftly from establishing a strong mindset, straight into self-discipline, pivoting into time management,
Jumping to handling failure.
briefly touching on passion, and finally wrapping up with visualization. As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that all these varied traits combine to build an architecture of success.
Right, they are all important pieces.
But from a pacing perspective, delivering back-to-back rapid-fire advice feels like trying to drink from a fire hose of inspiration. Just as the audience is internalizing the mechanics of time blocking, they are rushed into a deeply philosophical discussion about the nature of failure.
That's clearly laid out. I wonder, though, if we've considered the underlying structural cost of that rapid pacing, specifically regarding cognitive load.
Cognitive load. Break that down for me.
The core weakness here is that the narrative jumps from one massive abstract topic to another without a unifying structural spine, causing the argument to lose all momentum. When a script operates as a bulleted list of good ideas, working memory becomes overloaded.
Ah, I see.
Transitioning directly from time management into failure without a logical bridge forces the brain to dump the previous concept to make room for the new one. The listener ultimately walks away with a vague, generalized sense of motivation, but no concrete framework to hang that motivation on.
It reminds me of the difference between memorizing a dictionary and reading a novel. The dictionary gives you all the definitions, but the novel gives you the context that makes the definitions matter.
That is a perfect analogy.
You know, I noticed a fleeting line buried in the middle paragraph of this script. It says, "Think of your mind like a garden," but it's introduced and abandoned in the exact same breath.
Yeah, I caught that too.
My instinct is that visualization is simply looking at the seed before you plant it, but that still feels a bit thin to act as a structural spine for a 15-minute script.
Well, it is absolutely thin if we stop there. The suggestion for improvement is to consolidate these fragmented themes by expanding on that single powerful metaphor and using it as the foundational architecture for the entire piece.
Okay, so map everything to the garden.
Exactly. We have to expand the metaphor outward to encompass every topic on the writer's checklist. Visualization isn't just looking at the seed. It is the act of designing the layout of the garden before you ever touch a shovel.
Oh, I like that. What kind of life are you actually trying to cultivate?
Right, you force the listener to draw the blueprint.
So if visualization is the blueprint, then self-discipline fundamentally shifts from an abstract idea of working hard into the daily, unglamorous act of watering the dirt.
Showing up with the watering can every single day.
Especially on the days when the soil looks exactly the same as it did the morning before.
Yes, and time management ceases to be about arbitrary clocks and spreadsheets. Time management becomes the aggressive act of pulling the weeds of distraction.
The endless scrolling on a smartphone or the procrastination, those are invasive weeds.
If you don't aggressively pull them, they will inevitably choke out the language skills you are trying so desperately to grow.
Which naturally brings us to failure. In a garden, failure isn't burning the entire plot of land and salting the earth. Failure is simply a sudden frost that kills a crop.
You assess what went wrong, you turn the soil, and you prepare to plant again next season. It transforms the entire experience of the pacing.
It really does. The listener doesn't have to memorize a rigid checklist of 6 distinct success traits anymore.
They are taking a guided walk through a single, developing landscape. The brain relies on spatial and visual schemas to store complex information. By mapping these abstract concepts to a concrete physical space, like a garden, you give the listener a durable cognitive framework.
Okay, so we have this beautifully mapped garden, but looking closely at the script, it feels like the author forgot what kind of climate they're planting it in. The audience here isn't trying to grow a generic startup or optimize a corporate workflow. They're trying to learn a language.
Which leads us perfectly into our final major point. The dual purpose of motivational coaching and language instruction lacks true integration throughout the core message.
Let's look closely at the section discussing the daily English practice. There are undeniable nods to language learners scattered throughout the text.
Yeah, they mentioned the Slow English podcast.
Right, and dedicating 30 minutes a day to practicing vocabulary, reading simplified books, and avoiding the trap of watching one English video, feeling overwhelmed, and quitting.
But those moments feel curiously isolated.
They do. While the material makes a strong case for general life growth, the language learning aspect feels bolted on to the side. It reads like a secondary requirement rather than the main engine driving the emotional core of the piece. But let me play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Motivation is universal. The hard work required to build a business is the same psychological muscle required to memorize vocabulary. Why do we need to separate them so drastically?
Is there a risk that focusing solely on general success concepts might overlook the very specific, highly vulnerable psychological state of trying to become fluent in a new language?
Oh, that's a really interesting point.
That is the underlying weakness. General self-help assumes a baseline of competency. When you are learning a new language as an adult, you are dealing with a psychological barrier linguists call the affective filter, which is heavily influenced by the language ego.
The language ego. Right, so broad advice about investing time simply bounces off an adult who is paralyzed by the fear of sounding incompetent.
Exactly.
The language ego is such a critical barrier to acknowledge. You are dealing with an audience of fully formed adults. They have careers, mortgages, complex political opinions, and deep emotional lives.
But the moment they open their mouths to speak a new language, they are stripped of all that sophistication. She needs to say, it is safe to stumble. So the suggestion for improvement is to tailor the general self-development advice directly and exclusively to the linguistic journey.
We need to translate these broad motivational tropes into the precise emotional vocabulary of an English learner.
Yes, we have to lower that affective filter by addressing the exact scenarios that trigger their anxiety.
What does that translation look like practically on the page? Let's take the script's approach to the concept of failure. Currently, it says, failure is uncomfortable and makes you feel weak or lost, before pivoting to examples of inventors and businessmen making mistakes. How do we make that fit the specific vulnerability of the language ego?
Well, to an English learner, failure isn't a bankrupt company or a failed invention. Failure is visceral.
Yeah, it's very personal.
It is the hot-faced embarrassment of mispronouncing a crucial word during a professional meeting and seeing a colleague suppress a smile. Failure is the terrifying moment of freezing up when a native speaker asks a simple question at the grocery store.
Oh, wow. Yeah. The mind goes entirely blank, the throat tightens, and the learner just nods awkwardly and walks away in shame.
The writer needs to reframe the advice to address that highly specific, agonizing moment.
Because by bringing up the grocery store freeze, the writer proves they understand the actual stakes. They can tell the listener that freezing up
isn't a permanent reflection of their intelligence. It is simply a diagnostic tool highlighting exactly which conversational phrase they need to practice next.
It removes the moral weight from the mistake. And we can apply this exact same translation to the concept of tracking progress.
Right, the script currently states, when you see your improvement, you feel more motivated to continue, which is objectively true, but it is entirely generic. It lacks a mechanism.
A concrete example for this specific audience would be suggesting a precise language-based tool that relies on actual linguistic mechanics. Don't just tell them to track progress. Instruct them to keep a weekly voice memo diary.
Oh, I love that. Have them record themselves speaking freely into their phone for exactly 1 minute every Sunday morning.
Yes, and explain the psychology behind it. On day 1, they will hate the sound of their own voice. They will hyperfixate on the slow pacing and the mispronunciations.
But 6 months later, when they listen back to that very first recording, the contrast will be undeniable. They will actually hear the hesitations disappear.
Because language acquisition happens so slowly, day by day, learners suffer from a massive disconnect between perceived progress and actual progress. The voice memo diary maps the broad concept of motivation directly onto an actionable behavior that solves a specific psychological hurdle.
It fundamentally changes the value proposition of the script. It evolves from, here is some general life advice that you could maybe apply to your English studies, into a highly targeted survival guide for the emotional roller coaster of learning English.
Absolutely.
When you use their exact pain points, the motivation stops being superficial cheerleader advice. It becomes indispensable guidance.
That is the ultimate goal of any targeted material. You want the reader to feel completely seen by the text. By translating these broad concepts into the precise emotional reality of the listener, you prove that you don't just understand the mechanics of success. You understand the heavy daily reality of being an English learner.
This has been an incredibly rigorous and fruitful breakdown of the text. To summarize our session today, we have outlined 3 main actionable takeaways for strengthening this material from the ground up.
Right. Let's recap.
First, angle and originality. Replacing the generic, overused billionaire anecdotes with highly relatable ESL-specific scenarios, like the student studying in the quiet, dark kitchen, or leaning fully into the Jack Ma angle promised in the title. This avoids the trap of vicarious goal saturation and creates an attainable gap for the reader.
Essential for real motivation.
Second, structure and flow. Utilizing the existing, but buried, mind as a garden metaphor as a continuous structural spine to connect the pacing. By mapping visualization to designing the blueprint, discipline to daily watering, and failure to surviving a frost, we transform a rapid-fire cognitive overload into a seamless, easily retained thematic journey.
Much easier for the brain to digest.
And finally, audience alignment, deeply integrating the emotional reality of language learning into the motivational advice. By acknowledging the fragility of the language ego and reframing concepts like failure and progress tracking to address specific vulnerabilities, like the grocery store freeze or the voice memo diary, the piece becomes uniquely invaluable to its target demographic.
It really does.
We warmly invite the listener to implement these structural and thematic changes and submit the revised draft back to us for another critique. When we started today, we talked about that greatest hits album of motivational quotes.
Yeah, it's comfortable, it's familiar.
And it plays the exact same tunes we have all heard 1,000 times before. But by replacing those old tracks with genuine empathy and carefully tending to the specific, vulnerable garden of the language learner, this piece has the potential to become a wholly original work, one that resonates deeply and lingers long after the words fade.